So in our work, we're mostly focused on, at least in the paper that you mentioned, documenting collaborations in the life sciences. So we mostly look at the publication database PubMed, which is a life science publication database run by the National Institute of Health. And if you look at that database, in 2010, China was the fourth most frequent collaborator with US scientists in terms of number of publications. And so they were behind the UK, Germany, and Canada. And that changes in 2013 when China sort of overtakes all of the other countries in terms of number of collaborations with US scientists. And in 2016, we're seeing that go up. And it peaks in 2019 and is now sort of coming down. So the most recent data I think we've looked at is 2021, and China is still the most frequent collaborator in PubMed publications with US co-authors or with US scientists, but it's going down relative to the other countries. And if you think about like overall total at the peak in 2019, it's something like 8% of publications in PubMed that have an author, a US scientist author, have a collaborator at an institution in China.
Chen-Jen, thank you. You got to read that paper. It actually in one paper sort of shows the cost and benefits. Chen-Jen.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to echo what just been said. I think the collaboration has been really, really deep and wide up until 2018 or 19. And then it really cools down. I want to add to that the returnees to mainland China's top universities. Actually, you can see that trend too. At the level of postdoctoral fellows turning into assistant professor, at that level, it's been hot. It's even hot today. However, if you count senior members, I mean people who are tenured full professors, at that level, the total number dropped quite a bit. There used to be 4 or 5 meetings just to look at these candidates, and then now there are a few, but the number really drops. And a cross-border collaboration really drops quite a lot. And I think that is partially, at least, because of the China Initiative and the NIH accompanying policies, as well as on the China side, there are restrictions too. So I think the trend is there. However, I want to add something. The total output of scientists or social scientists from Chinese universities, their publications on major scientific journals has not been stopped. It's been up in a sense that the student learns from the teacher well, and then the student becomes as good as the teacher, sort of in that way. If you look at the Nature Index, major Chinese universities, including where I am at Peking University and Tsinghua, Fudan, Zhejiang, Jiaodao, you look at their Nature Index, which is a fairly good indicator of the true influence, impact of their research achievement. It's been a straight line up. So I want to add that piece of data to today's discussion. I'll stop here.
Yeah, Chen-Jen, I just want to make clear. So what you say is that in the returnees, that young students that study in the U.S. going back to China has gone up, yes, or stayed the same. But what about older? I wasn't clear what you said about older professors. These are tenured professors.
That number.
And what's the trend that they've been gone back to China at increasing rates?
No, I think after 2018, it started around 17, 18, and that number compared to before has decreased dramatically. Okay, there are still a few great professors going back, but the number, if you look at that number, it drops quite a lot.
I see. Okay, good. Deb.
So let me sort of expand the breadth here a little bit. So, and maybe the length too. So the U.S.-China science relationship really gets going in 1979 with the signing of our science and technology umbrella agreement, the first treaty signed after normalization, and therefore of enormous symbolic importance in China. You start in the 80s with huge interest in physics. If people remember the huge stream of students coming out of Hefei to the United States, and then that expands around the country. Things like dinosaurs. Inner Mongolia is an enormously wealthy area for finding cool bones. And the Smithsonian has been active with Chinese partners since that time. So I think people tend to think about sort of tech. It's great that we have a focus here in this group on life sciences, but it's so much broader than that. And the other thing to realize is it's not only about the volume of publications, where lots of other countries are also important partners, but it's the sort of policy influence that the research has, that the US and China have worked together on climate change, on sort of public health. And the US CDC was actually the primary mover in helping to create the China CDC. And so environmental stuff, we've had US EPA active with Chinese partners over this long period. All of this work blossomed particularly after the year 2000. President George W. Bush was very committed to this, and then it continued to expand under the Obama administration. So we have lots of academic scholar-to-scholar work, which is really important, but we also had a lot of work that sometimes leads to peer-reviewed papers, occasionally leads to patents, especially on the climate side. That was actually a goal in the Obama administration, but often leads to massive policy, including sort of the Chinese ability to measure air pollution, to measure climate gases, to measure and track all of the track and trace stuff that they actually did extremely well at the beginning of COVID, comes from collaborations that happened back in 2003 during SARS. So the collaboration has been exceptionally rich and varied, and in terms of actually helping our understanding of what's going on in China, both by social scientists, but also by scientists who then inform, work with the US government on issues like public health. It's been incredibly valuable over those years, and was at a peak, I'd say, in about 2015. The friction actually starts at the end of the Obama administration, but I think another administration might have chosen to manage that, and the Trump administration chose to start a withdrawal process that led funding to kind of drop and drop, so that I think Chen Jian's describing it sort of peaking in 2018 is about right.
Good. Well, there's a lot more out there. It's very rich. And there's also this enormous amount of student interaction with 500,000 US Chinese undergrad students coming to the United States, and at least learning about what's here, but also PhD students and postdocs coming here. I know with the decline of this relationship since 2018, the labs in some of our key universities, STEM universities, have been, screaming that they don't have those PhD students. So that there's also the people, the flow. That it's the other side of the people flow that Chen Jian talked about coming here. So I want to follow on that and tell you, just quote Mike Gallagher. He's the chairman of the House Select Committee on China. Many of you know him. And he said this is quote, for decades, the Chinese Communist Party has exploited the very openness of the heart of American society, academics, and our higher education system in particular, twisting this strength to the party's own advantage. The party's goal is not mutual benefit. Like we've sort of, we've seen all the mutual benefit there, but that's not the point. How do you assess the risks for the US when it comes to scholarly exchange with China. So the opposite side, that one of those powers that's really hampering this exchange. Why don't we, Chen-Jen, do you want to start, and then we'll go to Deb and back to Molly?
Okay, Scott, that's a sensitive topic, but I'll be frank. If I may, I want to start by saying I myself is a beneficiary or even a product of this cross-border globalized collaboration. I studied at Peking University for undergraduate and went to Peking Union Medical College, PUMC, which was established by Mr. Rockefeller. Arguably, it's the number one or, the best medical school. And then I came to the States. I went to Rockefeller University and then became a faculty member at Cornell Medical College. So if you look at my trajectory, the whole growth of my career life was a product of collaboration. And then, of course, I went to Peking University to perform education reform. So in that sense, I want to make that clear. The argument that was described, I think there's some truth to it, but I want to raise another thing. Don't forget, people who learned here and went back to China to do research, don't forget, these are also people, they are seeds for changes. Because bring with them is not only STEM, it's also a deeper fundamental view of the world. For example, science itself, it's about seeking truth through data evidence rather than doctrine, rather than propaganda, right? So when I was the vice provost and the dean at Peking University, my committee recruited more than 30 young faculty members from, to be assistant professors. I counted, only 3 of them did not get PhDs from the United States. So 27 out of more than 30. And these people, I think they are terrific. They're bright, budding, great young scientists. And although almost none of them participated in political reform and all that, they just do their own research. But I see them, the majority are exposed to the Western civilization. They do accept the universal value. So these are seeds for changes. Let's don't forget that. So that's my one argument. And for people-to-people exchange, Scott, you yourself is one of the greatest examples of how the presence of you and your project there and your collaboration, your students there, it's a positive change. So I want to raise that point. It's not all bad. We're being used. The other side is taking advantage of us. I think today's China is very different from 30 years ago. And a big part of that is due to the work of people like you and many of the returnees. So I'll stop here for now.
Okay. So Deb, go on. So I took away from Chen-Jen that the risks are overstated for Mr. Gallagher. Deb, your turn.
I think there's enormous risk to decoupling. So the first thing is it's kind of an ironic puzzle that at the moment when Chinese collaborators are at the level where they can contribute equally to any project, we're now worried about losing knowledge, right? Because, as one of the scholars I respect most in China commented to Science Magazine sort of early in the COVID discussions, it used to be you were the teachers and we're the students, but that's not true anymore. And he wasn't saying we're now the teachers, he's saying we're now equals, right? And you have to actually respect that we know what we're doing. But the result of that is just like working with a British collaborator or a Canadian collaborator or a Japanese collaborator, there's just enormous productivity gains, which are the things that Molly documents from working with the best and the brightest wherever they are. And so we're at a moment where we actually can gain a lot from working with Chinese partners. Now, in fact, over decades where China was very much in learning mode, we also felt we were gaining a lot because there were a lot of other things we gained. Access to all those brilliant PhD students, access to data, access to samples and diseases and dinosaur bones and all kinds of things, right? By the time of the whichever IPCC assessment on climate change came out in 2003, fully 10% of the global co-authors were from China because of the huge emphasis on modeling and calculation in Chinese academic institutions. And so we just have gained an enormous amount in terms of science. And so the question comes, what happens if we cut off what has become the richest single connection between US and Chinese scientists? And I think what happens is that global science as a whole becomes weaker, as it has at any era in global history where people start cutting themselves off from each other, whether we want to talk about the Middle Ages or whatever, that it's not that China will become the center of world. The US is the center of world science right now. It's not that if we cut off from China, that China becomes the center of world science, because quite frankly, most scientists in the US and Europe and Japan don't want to base themselves in China. But what happens is science becomes more fractured, that there will be more sort of centers of things happening in many different places and less of this agglomeration that we have in the United States. And the eras of the richest science have been when Paris was the center or when the United States was the center. And so the question becomes, if we decenter ourselves, and I think this is true more generally of international relations, we don't create a separate center. What we create is a more fractured world, which in other areas can be dangerous. In this area, I think it's going to slow progress.
Yeah, so neither Chunjin or Deb sort of said there's risks out there. I mean, you might think so, but I think what you're saying is that the cost of doing this is much higher than the risks of some of the risks that Mike Gallagher's talking about. What do you think, Molly?
Yeah, so I agree that with Chenjian and Deb that both there are risks of decoupling. Let me just sort of talk about the risks that the community is talking about what the risks of collaboration might be, and then we can try to figure out, like, well, where might the balance lie? So I think the risks that people are worried about are national security risks, so risks of research collaborations on some things that could be dual use, some things that could be used by the military. US and China are adversaries, I would say, and so that could be a risk where that could hurt US security. Okay, so that's one risk that people are worried about, and we have seen instances that have come up in the news where people have gotten really worried about this stuff. The other is IP commercialization. So there are some people, I think, who are worried that there could be, in these collaborations, there could be that maybe the collaborators in China would commercialize something first, and that would have a negative effect on the US economy in this era of economic competition. Actually, Ruishui Jia and I did this survey of policymakers, members of think tanks, and social scientists about where people thought the risks were, and we're writing this up, so we'll have it available soon. And people thought this was actually the least concerning. So I think, and in general, that's my opinion too. And then the third is human rights risks. So ethical questions around collaborations on technologies that could be used for human rights abuses. I think people are worried about this, and I think that there is some legitimate risk in some areas on that. And I think the question that we have is, like, how do you balance those risks with the reward, which I think Deb and Chenjian laid out very well, of collaboration. And I think where policymakers have sort of erred, maybe especially in the 2016 to 2018 era, was sort of saying, any research with a collaborator in China could be dual use. And so we should have no collaborations. But is that really minimizing risk? In my opinion, it's not. In my opinion, minimizing risk would be encouraging collaboration on projects that are not relevant to national security and don't have human rights risk. And and I think that gets to be a little bit tricky, because how do you define those things? But I actually think that, a lot of the national security relevant research in the US is done in classified labs anyway that are very protected. So if we're talking about open science here, things that are going to be published anyway, we have to sort of start thinking about, okay, what are the costs of trying to say minimize that research versus the benefits of being really open. And I think there are conditions maybe that US policymakers could set on research, or universities. So MIT has come out with some guidelines for researchers on engagement with China to sort of think about these benefits and risks. But I do think there are ways to minimize it without just sort of saying there should be no US-China collaborations in science, which seems to be, that's quite strong, I think, for the amount of risk, which I think those risks are real, but can be minimized in other ways.
Chen Jian, certainly, Chen Jian.
Yeah, can I follow up? I do agree with that, and I do not want to downplay the potential risks. I want to counterbalance myself, because there is a clear competition, and I think the uncertainty and the sort of conflicting feeling for myself is the big framework is uncertain. Let's put it in the most blunt way. Our two nations, competitors, pretty friendly competitors, or more strategic rivals, or even worse, adversaries, or even just enemies? So that question is huge, because if it were in the adversary and the enemies sort of category, then you should not do anything with each other, right? I mean, imagine in Second World War, would Oppenheimer pick a phone and call Heisenberg and say, dude, your calculation is off by 10-fold, correct that and you will get your bomb? You won't. So now, but the problem is, are we there? So that a lot of people have different opinions. People look at South China Sea, Taiwan, and say, yes, it is that urgent. Other people say, no, it's way over exaggerated. So I don't know. But I do want to mention another thing, which is Deb already mentioned. For open source science, we publish, and even patents. Remember, the criteria for a good patent to be admitted, to be approved, is people with reasonable expertise can repeat and really get your results, right? In scientific papers we publish, we have to write the materials and methods section so much that in detail that people can repeat that. Therefore, to block open source science, technically, it's very difficult. That's first. Second one is, if you look at universities, what are you going to do to approve or disapprove collaborations? There are clear case ones. For example, people are making, military technologies, sure. But my difficulty is, remember, today, theoretical work, practical work, and translational work are united and merged. And I have a phrase to describe that, which is, from E equals mc squared to mushroom cloud, the distance is much shorter than we thought. So as a university leadership team, what are you going to do if someone is studying mathematics? You prove it or you disapprove, because mathematics used to be pure science. Now it's the foundation of all the practical ones, including AI. What are you going to do? Material science, physics, and all that. So in the practical sense, it raises a serious question for selected, nuanced process. in reality, I would imagine it's very hard to do. The MIT guideline is a good start, but in implementation, I would love to follow up and see how they are doing that. Because on my side, I look at that and say, whoa, it's hard to do it in practice. I'll stop here.
Deb, please.
So I agree with almost everything Chen just said, except for the part about that you don't work with your enemies. So I think the correct analogy isn't a hot war with Germany, but it was the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And as I've been working on this question of the renewal of the U.S.-China S&T agreement, I've wound up having the pleasure to talk to some, truly great elderly scholars who were involved in the Pugwash process with the former Soviet Union. And they make the point that it was physicists talking to physicists that, first of all, helped us understand where capabilities were. So it actually improves our national security by knowing what's going on. And second of all, was critical to actually being able to come to arms control agreements. So that cutting ourselves off just because things are difficult, I think, is extremely risky, actually. And of course, on other areas, it was during the height of the Cold War that the US and the Soviet Union collaborated to eradicate smallpox. So we were actually also able to generate global public goods in the midst of actual hot proxy wars around the world. So I don't think we have to necessarily be more pessimistic about science. I think we can still be more optimistic. And I think that gets back to thinking about how to manage risk appropriately and to really consider narrowly what is a national security risk. So I think Chen-Jian's absolutely right that most things are dual use. I mean, in fact, all health is. I mean, it was only maybe World War II that you had more soldiers dying in war than of disease. Disease control is core to hot wars, actually. So I do think that we're never going to get around this dual use issue. And so we really do have to think about what is classified research and what is open source, because as he explained so well, that's just available to everyone anyway. And so with the issue of classified research and China's access to it, that goes all the way back to the Cox report in the 1990s, and lots of allegations that were all untrue, that US national labs were vulnerable. In fact, they're very well protected. But there have also been critical places where US national labs actually saw it in the US national interest to work with Chinese contacts. For example, we know that China is a nuclear state. We want to make sure that they are protecting their nuclear weapons and keeping them safe and ensuring they don't get in the wrong hands. That is the kind of thing that we have discussed with the Chinese over decades, right? So this fear of interaction, I think, can be very harmful, but even more and so I think the analogy to the nuclear situation during the Cold War is actually AI today. I am not an AI researcher by any stretch of the imagination, but what people in the AI field say to me is the only way we're going to know what's going on in China is actually by working with them. And so not only will our AI be much weaker if we don't, but we will also be blind. And I think the other thing to realize is that the Chinese often invest in different parts of science than we do. And so for our scientists to really reach their full potential and find everything they need to find often requires working with Chinese collaborators. I have a colleague here at Villanova who works on carbon sequestration in wetlands and mangroves and things like that. Super important for climate change. Turns out that these wetlands sequester way more CO2 than dryland forests. Well, where's the big experiment that she's really able to look at this in the field? It's in Fujian. She is not a China hand. She has nothing to do with China, but she is busy collecting data on mangrove trees in Fujian. Could we be doing this in Florida? 100%. Are we doing it? No. Neither the state of Florida nor the federal government is spending the kind of money that it requires to plant hectares and hectares of mangroves. And so, and you know, Steve Kevelson, who led one of the letter writing drives supporting the S&T agreement, his thing is about manufacturing access that he needs in China to support what his lab does in the US. There are all these examples where we only get to our full potential when we're working together. But when we do that, we learn more, not just about science, but about China.
Hey, Deb, thank you. Yes. So, and I think Deb got to the heart of the problem, that, you know, we aren't going to have pure open access, and Mike Gallagher wants total control, total shutdown, because everything is national security. So the question becomes, how do we, and I think the thing is we are going to worry about national security. I mean, that is de-risking. So the question that we worked with in this track to diplomacy and scholarly exchanges, how do we define that? How do we get leaders to define it? They don't want to define it. And if they don't define it, then lower level visa, the people who grant visas, the administrators that give interviews to our academics, the whole gamut, that they start being more risk averse and scholarly exchange contracts. And so I think that's what I heard, and that's difficulty. Why don't we sort of step on from that and ask, sort of, what do you think then are the most problematic obstacles? Is it the laws? Is it the funding curbs? Is it travel restrictions? Investigations that the two governments have sort of put up in recent years that are reducing collaboration and exchange, rightfully or wrongly, right? Depending, you know, where we are. And so what's the U.S. losing by put up these barriers and China losing? So we're sort of gone there, but really, how is this happening? And so if we want to keep scholarly exchange going, you know, what mechanism do we want to look at? Deb, you just finished there, so why don't we do maybe Molly and Chunjin and Deb?
Yeah, so what are the barriers that are influencing this right now? So I think one of the things that you just mentioned that's really important is I think there's not a lot of clarity in the minds of scientists about what is okay and what is not okay. And because of the history now with the China Initiative, which is obviously now not happening anymore, investigations from US funding agencies, there's a lot of worry that there will be increased scrutiny for academics who collaborate with China, and because of this increased scrutiny, they might be found to have done something wrong. And so it's better just to stay away completely and not do any collaborations, because you could do things could happen to you, like you could be investigated, you could lose your job, you could lose your funding. Then those things are all sort of the center of, you know, your work, right? And certainly there are a lot of scientists who feel like they were targeted unfairly or were treated unfairly in this process. And so I think what needs to happen is a reduction in policy ambiguity. Right now, there's a lot of policy ambiguity, and some of it is hard to get around because, for example, we don't know what administration will be coming in 2024. They may have very different policies. There's some of that is difficult to get around just by the structure. But others, I think there could be a lot more clarity around shaping what are the things that policymakers think shouldn't be in open science, shouldn't be applied, shouldn't be allowed in US-China collaborations, or in international collaborations more generally. I think policymakers really need to carve that out very explicitly, because the problem with not doing that is right now there's this sort of widespread chilling effect where people don't want to do those collaborations. And I think, you know, we've laid out the costs of that pretty clearly already in this panel, but the costs are not being on the edge of science, because being part of these international teams is where a lot of the science is happening. If our scientists are worried about going to China to go to conferences, they might lose out on some of the conversations that are happening there. If our scientists are worried about recruiting talent from China, they're going to lose out on some of the top talent. And that's in just generally that openness that Mike Gallagher referred to is why US science is leading. And so that is what we have to protect. And so being very clear about and very transparent in the spirit of science about what is okay and what is not okay, I think that's like the most important barrier right now in the US. I also think there are barriers in China. And I think that especially in social sciences, but also in science as well, like the national security law has made it more difficult for people to travel and feel comfortable traveling. I think the data protection law has also created some challenges for academic exchange in a lot of different areas. There are very few students studying in China, and what Deb said before about the problem with that is that we, you know, it's very important, especially as US-China tensions get more tense, that the US has people who understand China and who are able to advise policymakers on China, and not having that exchange is important in, you know, making sure that the relationship doesn't end up in, you know, a really bad place that could be bad for everyone. So I think that that there are barriers on from China policy. There are also barriers in U.S. policy. I think a general principle of openness with, like, you know, the small yard, high fences, really clear definition of what should be off limits. I think that's where we need to go.
Yeah, it's right. Yes. I think a lot of people know this, but I just had a meeting with Nicholas Burns, the ambassador from the U.S. to China, and he's very, very much behind trying to increase the flow of American students to China. There's 300,000 Chinese students studying in America today. Last year, 2022, there were 300 U.S. students. This year, it's expanded greatly to 800. Now, Xi Jinping told Joe Biden in the recent APEC meetings he wants it to be 50,000 over the next 5 years. And you know, I think that, you know, if the China side opens up, we now need to really identify the barriers that are keeping U.S. students from going. And I thought your comments were perfect. Chen Jian, what do you have to say?
I'll follow the argument one step more. I think, to use a metaphor, when we are supposed to use a scalpel, don't use a sledgehammer. So if we are going to make that clear, what are allowed, what are not allowed, clearly to the scholars and students, I think it's also up to us to participate, the scholars and students. We should not push the responsibility to senators and White House and say, hey, you guys tell us. No. I think it's the other way. We are supposed to come up with a plan, say, look, this will balance the national security issue and the open science issue and a benefit for us and the global citizens. So I would advocate for scientists like us, we actively participate, because it is difficult. It is a scalpel kind of work. That's what I want to advocate at this point.
Deb.
So I agree that there are things that are barriers on both sides. It's absolutely the case that people in China are also much more nervous about sort of whether the government is going to approve or disapprove of what they're doing. That really varies a lot by topic, as I think both Scott, you and I know, because if you're working on a topic that is a Chinese government priority, things are a lot easier. Of course, you do get insights into things that aren't, which helps inform the United States. So I think even though there are limitations, it's still incredibly important to do the work. One thing I think was positive on the Chinese side is they came out with clarifications to the data law that were in draft in October, and I don't know whether they've been fully adopted yet. That's something that I should check. But if they're adopted as written, I think they're going to be a big help to academics. They don't solve a lot of the problems that companies have with data, but they do encourage academic exchange. But our ability to change Chinese policy is probably relatively limited, but I think there's some very specific things the United States could do, because I think, so the first is, if Nicholas Burns is really serious that he wants more American students to go to China, they have got to change the travel warning. It's currently at a level 3, which says reconsider travel. Many universities will automatically advise their undergraduates that they shouldn't travel to a place with a level 3 travel warning. And undergraduate students are not particularly at high risk of arbitrary detention in China relative to other places. Most undergraduates who get in trouble in China do so for bar fights, and they could just as easily get in trouble for that in many other countries of the world. So I think they really need to think about that. The second thing concretely I think the United States could do is send an NSF representative back to Beijing. We had a National Science Foundation representative in Beijing from about 2005 until early in the Trump administration, when they pretty much sent all of the NSF reps around the world home in a sort of general cutback of global science. In terms of having really good dialogues on science policy with Chinese, NSF was invaluable. NSF also ran a summer program that was specifically about helping American PhD students spend a summer in a Chinese lab. They had done this in Japan, they've done this in France. And the concern is that unlike most other countries in the world where there actually is encouragement that people who go through a PhD program spend part of their time, whether it's part of their PhD or a postdoc, in another country, most American scientists spend all their time in the United States. So NSF has long had efforts to try to ensure that American scientists know more what's going on in the rest of the world. That program was cut off in the Trump administration. There are things that we could do that are specifically about helping us have those greater interactions in China and learn more about what's going on. And those are things that US policy can do unilaterally. I completely agree with Molly about the ambiguity and how I think it's really affecting young scholars, especially of Chinese origin, that it is perceived nowadays as very risky to work with Chinese collaborators if you have Chinese family connections, if you spent part of your life growing up in China, because of those NIH investigations, because of the China initiative. I think that absolutely has to be clarified, and it's going to require a lot of work. And the truth is, it's part of what's dissuading Chinese PhD students from applying for US PhDs, because 20 years ago, you could imagine a career where you'd be able to have one foot in each country, and you'd be able to comfortably go back to China and do some work there and have a life in the United States, and it looked really nice. Now, I think a lot of scholars of Chinese origin feel like they have to choose. And if they go and they do their PhD program in Germany or in the UK or in Canada, they don't feel they're going to have to choose as much. And so I think that's hurting us as well. So it isn't enough to just say the China initiative is over. Things like the US attorney in Boston actually apologizing to Chang'an for that ridiculous indictment. It's more than Chinese alleging that there have been improper prosecutions. We've now had multiple cases, some of which have been fully proven in court, where there were improper prosecutions. And some apologies for some of those, I think, might go a ways to making it clear what is going on inside the FBI, because I think most people don't trust it even now.
Yeah, I think just expanding on what Molly and all three of you said is making things clear. You know, that last year the number of applicants from Chinese to the U.S. PhDs and postdocs went way down, and of course, what the U.S. government said was, you know, that, I mean, what people were saying was, well, they're afraid to come to the U.S. because, you know, both, yes, there has been the China initiative, and yes, you know, it's advertised within China that there's a lot of negative sort of portrayal of U.S. society. It's violent, it's anti-China. But if you go to the websites, and my colleague here at Stanford scraped the web and looked at the web of people talking about this, basically young PhDs candidates or you know, wannabe postdocs, they aren't applying to the U.S. because they aren't getting visas. That's the number one reason. And it's right back to what Molly says. It's because, you know, hey, they're going to engineering or life sciences, and that is national security, or might be, or dual use. And I think that this is where you need to be I think we need to be very, very clear, is that, you know, this is the academic sphere here. Yeah, sure, this is perhaps those labs that are doing national security, but most of it's not. And so I still think that is one of the real barriers that I heard all three of you sort of talk about. We're getting towards the end here, but let's sort of step back. Tell me whatever you want to think. But sort of the U.S. is the world's leader in scholarly output. By limiting scholarly exchange with China, the U.S. is ensuring its comparative advantage in science, innovation, knowledge production for the foreseeable future, right, is going to be undermined, right? Put another way, the U.S. may lose something when limiting scholar exchange, but China loses more. We're in a competitive situation. Yeah, I think you've all addressed this. Maybe thinking of this as sort of what the audience should take away. What do you think? Chun-Jen and then Deb and Molly, you can sort of wrap it up, but then you can jump on the other person if you don't agree.
Okay. I would say less adamant than Deb, because I do see more the factor of the risks in terms of national security. I do acknowledge a little bit more than that. However, still, I would advocate for what I call the principled exchange and engagement. We do need to vet. We do need to look at detailed projects and their dual use. However, I'm much more on the side of keep the exchange because of the following facts. First of all, don't forget, for Chinese students who obtained PhDs in the United States, 90% of them stayed. So United States gets the better part of end of the bargain by overwhelming benefit in that sense. So I think we should keep that to make it strong. The United States is strong because it's a global talent place. Everybody comes here and develop. So I want to keep that. And the second is I want to advocate a nuanced approach to even PhD and postdoc vetting process. Currently, I think it's really by the word. The same, my student, if he says, I study mathematics, great. If he says, I will pursue AI, probably he's going to be rejected. But it doesn't mean anything. We need to do a better job. But the job is really difficult. I acknowledge that. How do we actually do that at Stanford, for example? It's really challenging. But I agree with that because it's difficult, that's why we need to get to work hard sort of in those aspects. But I would love to keep a healthy level of exchange. unless, of course, the situation deteriorates to further, it's really becoming adversary or even worse than that, then I will definitely rethink about it. Other than that, let's keep the exchange at a healthy level. I think that's the best to everybody.
Yeah.
So the percentage of students going back to China has actually gone up in recent years. I think it's about 25% now instead of 10%. But your larger point is real. I think my point about national security is that I think it is manageable and has been manageable for years. It's not that in fact the traditional national security establishment has not known how to protect U.S. national security. And I think everybody else getting involved in it, which is sort of what's happened with the securitization of the China relationship in Washington, and people who know nothing about science and very little about national security suddenly deciding this area is a security issue and that area is a security issue has muddied the waters. I mean, our national labs are well protected. We have clear delineation between published science and classified science. You know, there's a lot we already have. And so we're not reinventing the wheel here. I 100% agree with Molly that what we need is far greater clarity. And we also need to ensure, I mean, because, you know, I don't know if any of you read Maya Hirschfield's book, I think it was called The Scientist and the Spy, about this, I mean, it's actually was a story about the gang that couldn't shoot straight, right? I mean, it's these guys running around trying to steal seeds all over America, when it turns out if they actually had the scientific skills they needed, they could have reverse engineered the whole thing in a lab in Beijing. But the thing is, this was actually a Chinese private company that had, you know, one of these wonderful bootstrap companies where the CEO, you know, would been a taxi driver or something. And so, and yet this gets turned into this national scandal that our agricultural security is at risk. And this is actually a kind of crazy story with no larger implications. And there have been a number of these that get hyped in the media that really don't tell us anything about our real risks. And I think that there are people who understand what our real risks are and are managing them pretty well. And maybe we need a few more things here and there. And I also think we can decide which fields we want to work on more and which we want to work on less. But what we don't want to do is, you know, throw out the baby with the bathwater and cut off all science when we could be doing highly productive things on areas that where we face massive global risks, and we need the wealth of both US and Chinese science to address it, like climate change, like the next pandemic, which is coming way sooner than any of us want. And so I think we need to be realistic and also accept the fact that there are larger risks than some Chinese scientists getting a patent, right? That there are actually global risks that need science to move faster, not slower. Thanks.
Molly.
Yeah, so the question asked about, you know, competition. So will cutting off collaborations with scientists in China make US science more competitive? And I kind of think this I think of science in an international trade framework, that they are gains from trade, from trading, right? They're comparative advantages. They're ways in which science gains from more openness, from more collaboration, just as trade. And then there are also risks that we have to manage, right? But I think if the US wants to compete with China, that we should compete. And that means that we should fund science more within the US. We should compete at home. We should fund science more in the US. We should be better at attracting the best talent. Like, that should be a fundamental goal of US science, is to attract the best talent from around the world, not just from China, but from everywhere, right? And to maintain our advantage in attracting talent. It should also be to double down on what we do best in science, which is openness, transparency, making sure, integrity in science, research integrity. I think all of those things that the U.S., this is why the U.S. is leading in science and has led in science for the past decades. Peer review, taking politics out of science, academic freedom. All of these things are things that the U.S. needs to double down on. If we double down on more funding in science, more academic freedom, more transparency, more academic integrity, all of those things, we will continue to lead science. But I think that let's stop this collaboration with scientists in China as a way of keeping the U.S. more competitive. It's really a red herring. If you want to keep the U.S. more competitive, let's invest in science. Let's reinvest. Let's invest in universities. Let's invest in R&D. All of the things that we need to be on the forefront of technology. And that's where I think the policymakers are in this space have sometimes, not always, there are a lot of policymakers working really hard to do that science investment. But sometimes I feel like China, stopping China, it shouldn't be the answer. It should be building the U.S. That's the answer.
Right.
If I can add one more point.
Yes, Chen Jin.
Yeah, following that, I want to leave with a positive note. I think the dominant position, the leadership of United States universities, top-tier universities all over the world is still strong and it's stable. We are not in a panic mode and say, everything's falling apart. No, it's not. I've been to the best universities here and in China. The United States is really strong and in leadership position that is stable. So we can deal with things with nuanced patience. Thank you.
Wow. That hour went by fast. I've been taking notes the whole time, and I've really learned a lot. Just to try to summarize very quickly, there's huge benefits to exchange and collaboration, gains from trade. I like to think of it that way as an economist. U.S.-China relations has been a huge sort of mechanism for trade over the past several decades, and has created a lot of benefit for the world, for the United States, for China. Things are down. There's barriers there. We've heard the barriers. They're investigative, people fearing to come. They're losing funding. There's visas problems to get in here. On the China side, there's laws, there's data laws, there's securities laws. On the U.S. side, we sort of scare students off from going, and there's a handful of students over there, while we need more. I think that as we've stepped back and say, let's revise the laws and let's get rid of the investigations and not tie funding to it. But I think what everybody said, what we really, really need to do is to establish clarity. And I think our track 2 global team came up with the exact same result, is that the top leaders of the country have to say, that these things are not national security, and then we should have stopped right. We should have Chen Jin give his final words before he said that, but then Molly saying, right, we have freedom, open, a system with integrity, and we need support for that. And that's the system that's made America and made the world, and we need to keep those collaborations going. So I want to thank everyone, Molly, for doing all your research. Keep it going. You got to send us this next paper soon. Chen Jin, having you as my colleague here is fantastic. There's lots we're going to learn from. And Deb's done so much. I mean, she's working so hard now on the science and technology agreement, as well as just keeping the relationship going. So thank you, everyone. We're going to take about a 10-minute break, and we'll be back in Ilaria. We'll be basically hosting the next session. You don't want to miss it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Welcome, everyone, to the third panel of the day, Between Backlash and Balancing, the State of China's Foreign Relations. My name is Ilaria Mazzocco, and I'm a senior fellow in the trustee chair of Chinese Business and Economics at Csis. And I'm delighted today to be hosting a group of brilliant researchers that I will be introducing in just a second to discuss China's foreign policy and relations with other countries. There's only one housekeeping item before I move forward. People watching us live can submit their questions. So if you're watching us live on our website, you can see there's a button that says Ask Question, and you can submit your questions there. Let me introduce our panelists today. We have Yunnan Chen. Yunnan is a research fellow in ODI's Development and Public Finance program. Her work centers on the changing development finance architecture and the role of global China, with a specialist interest in the role of Chinese development finance, overseas lending and debt architecture, and the role of national development banks and development finance institutions in Africa. Previously, she was a Global China Initiative Fellow at the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University. She was also a researcher at the Csis China Africa Research Initiative and a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. We'd also have Carla Freeman joining us from Washington. She is a senior expert for the China program at the U.S. Institute of Peace, USIP. She specializes in China's foreign policy, China and non-traditional security issues, and U.S.-China relations. For more than a decade, she was a member of the China Studies faculty at the Johns Hopkins Csis, where she directed the school's Foreign Policy Institute. In 2020, she held the appointment of Library of Congress Chair in U.S.-China Relations at the library's Kluge Center. She is the author of numerous scholarly writings and policy reports. She is currently working on a report for USIP on China's Global Security Initiative and a book project on China's impact on the Earth's planetary frontiers. And then finally, Francesca Ghiretti, an expert on Europe-China relations and economic security. She currently covers the role of senior geoeconomics analyst at the Adarga Research Institute, which uses AI technology to support research. Previously, Francesca worked as analyst at Merix and as a research fellow at the Italian Institute for Foreign Affairs. She holds a PhD from the Center for Grand Strategy at War Studies, King's College London, and is now working on a book based on her PhD thesis on the theme of economic security. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Great. So before we move on to the discussion, let me set the scene a little bit. It's interesting that last year when I hosted a panel in the last year's China Big Data China conference, we were discussing in the panel how China was going to transition out of zero COVID. So I think this is just worth remembering because in just one year we've really moved very quickly out of zero COVID, which of course really restricted the types of activities that foreign engagement that China could have physically with other countries. Of course, diplomacy went down nonetheless. But also there's just been a resurgence of summits, travel of leaders from China and of other countries to China. Most recently here in the U.S., of course, we were all watching the leadership summit of APEC in San Francisco when Biden and Xi Jinping met in San Francisco. And right now, COP28 is undergoing. Of course, the BRI summit happened. And of course, the EU-China summit is going to be happening in just a couple of days. This is just a few of many other events that took place. And I think these are, a reminder of all the different types of engagements that China has with different countries and the variety also of diplomatic activities. There's also been many different geopolitical changes over the past few years. Of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been what many have called sort of a reminder that geopolitics still matters. And also, of course, the U.S.'s introduction of export controls on advanced semiconductors towards China has also had, a ripple effect on global relations. So, given all these different trends and the complicated stage at the moment that China faces, I wanted to ask each one of you, how you see the past year and what you see have been the most important trends over the past year. So I wanted to start with Carla, and if you can give us sort of an overview, and especially given your expertise on China's engagement with the global commons and the global governance, how you see things have developed in the past year.
Thanks so much, Ilaria. I hope everybody can hear me. It's an honor to join you, and I've really enjoyed a few of the previous sessions today and looking forward to the next hour of discussion as well. So I will give a brief run through of developments in Chinese foreign policy in the past year. And as you had alluded to, it's been an action-packed year. China's reopened after nearly a 3-year lockdown, and suddenly its officials and leaders, including Xi Jinping, took to the road for a global diplomatic campaign designed to rebuild some of China's important relationships and improve others that weren't so, it hadn't assigned enough priority to, and also to engage in some new multilateral and global governance initiatives that are really designed to showcase China's capabilities and influence in a far more direct and also strategic way aimed at transforming international organizations and also rules and norms in line with China's interests and preferences. So on one hand, China's foreign policy activities were aimed in those sort of more geopolitical directions. They also were aimed at restoring international confidence in China's economy, which had been shaken not only by COVID, but also by some of the policy changes Xi Jinping introduced. And this conference has already covered China's economy in a really excellent panel. So I'll focus on some of China's other policy activities. Let me frame my remarks by putting 3 categories up on the board. Symmetry, which you alluded to again, Ilaria, in your opening comments, Wang Yi plus panda diplomacy, and then Xi Jinping's new global initiatives. On the symmetry front, China's diplomats engaged in what seemed like countless summits in 2023. Frankly, I was going to count them up for the audience, and I got too tired. There were so many. Some of them were held in China, but a lot of them were overseas, and a lot of them were attended by Wang Yi. VP Han Zheng handled some of them, including the UN General Assembly in September. But Xi also attended a few himself. Fewer than actually he had attended in person in 2022, which is sort of interesting. But the ones that he did attend do offer an indication of China's foreign policy priorities in 2023. And these were the BRICS Summit in South Africa in August. Then, of course, the Third Belt and Road International Cooperation Summit was held in Beijing in October. And then, as you mentioned as well, the APEC Summit in San Francisco, where Xi traveled to meet with Biden on the sidelines. Notably, Xi didn't attend the G20 in Delhi. He sent Premier Li Qiang to that, nor did he join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit that he hadn't attended in person the previous year. He did that online. No doubt, Xi wanted to be present at the BRICS Summit, which saw the expansion of the grouping with the addition of 6 new members, which adds additional international clout to this grouping of emerging and developing economies. Then at BRI, Xi hosted the group again in Beijing, gathered 20 heads of state, fewer than in the previous forum a number of years ago, but a lot of other countries were represented. And that gave Xi a chance to pledge to sustain China's commitment to the initiative and also to lay the groundwork for a BRI secretariat to be developed. So if these 2 summits reflect China's interest in expanding its leadership of developing countries through some new institutional developments where it can play a leading and shaping role that supplement or complement or act as off-ramps or alternatives to Bretton Woods, at least the APEC Summit, in contrast, really focused on engaging in a summit that a very diverse array of countries participate in and clearly reflected an effort to stabilize the US-China relationship. And there we can talk more about the priorities that came out and the agreements that came out of that. Second, I would say that China's foreign policy became a lot about Wang Yi, the world's hardest working diplomat. Wang leads the Chinese Communist Party's foreign policy apparatus. He was back as China's foreign minister suddenly everywhere all at once in the second half of 2023 after Qin Gang, former ambassador to the United States, and Wang's successor for at least part of 2023 after he was removed amid a slew of salacious rumors. One of two key figures in the Chinese state's foreign policy apparatus to be removed after short tenures. The second, of course, was Minister of Defense Li Shangfu. Although Qin was not in wolf warrior mode when he was ambassador to the US, and he also used a pretty moderate tone when he was China's foreign minister, previously he was known as one of the pioneers of China's wolf warrior diplomacy. And his removal put a period, at least a stop, at least for now, on that sort of shrill diplomatic rhetoric that was associated with China's wolf warriors like Qin and acolytes like Zhao Lijian during the heights of the COVID epidemic and Twitter diplomacy. And this shift was also reflected in the return of panda diplomacy. Giant pandas apparently are still awards for good international behavior. They also can be taken away. Washington lost its beloved pandas, but California, whose governor, of course, traveled to China this year, might get some. So that was interesting. And then finally, China was busy campaigning for a number of really interesting international initiatives. Move over BRI, because now we've got the Global Civilization Initiative announced in March of this year, and campaigning for the Global Development Initiative underway since 2021, and last year the Global Security Initiatives. These are all new made in China concepts for new approaches to managing global challenges. We know the most about the still vague GDI and GSI, and maybe Yunnan can discuss the GDI if she has time, but that seems to be focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. The Global Security Initiative, though, proposes an improved, again, made in China approach to global governance of global security, and based on security concepts that are closely associated with Xi. And it's also become a kind of rhetorical banner for this new type of high-profile Chinese diplomacy that China's undertaken over the past year to demonstrate its ability to act as a peace broker in some presumably intractable strained relationships like the Saudi-Iran rapprochement of last March. So finally, let me just end with two very quick additions for possible discussion. 2023 was characterized by China continuing to make ties with Russia a priority. Xi made a visit to Russia, his first international visit of his third term in office that began in March of this year. But China at the same time has a campaign to woo Europe that's underway. China also passed a new foreign affairs law, which I have to say I don't know anything about, but it seems like it's something worth studying because it enshrines a number of China's foreign policy priorities into law. And this includes providing foreign aid to developing countries and strengthening solidarity with developing countries. And there's some other aspects of the law that really seem pretty hard to square with China's foreign policy behavior in its own region and also on some broader strategic issues. So that raises some questions about what the significance of this unprecedented law are. So, or maybe. So I'll stop there, Ilaria. Thanks for letting me go on a bit too long.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I'm sure we'll be coming back to many of these different themes. So I'll go on to Yunnan, since I think you mentioned her and you've definitely mentioned several of the topics that she covers regarding China's relations with the Global South, the BRI, and the Global Development Initiative. Yunnan, off to you.
All right. Well, following that headline act, I think the past year for me signals a critical juncture in China's relations with the Global South, primarily through the Belt and Road Initiative, and now this diversification of new acronyms through which China is trying to engage with partner countries. This year marked, of course, 10 years of the One Belt, One Road, or Belt and Road Initiative that was originally announced in 2013. It was also a year where the BRI was, I feel like, curiously downplayed for much of the year until, leading up to the forum itself, suddenly everything was announced with a lot of fanfare. But this marks a period over the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years in which we've seen a shift in China's relations with developing countries, and its role over the last 2 decades as one of the most important providers of development finance and official financing for the Global South. We've all seen that in the years leading up to COVID, there's been a lot of backlash to China's role as a creditor to Global South countries. There's been a lot of accusations of predatory lending and debt traps, and whilst I don't think there's been actually any solid evidence of asset seizures as part of Chinese loans, undoubtedly Chinese lending has contributed to some of the problem around unsustainable debt burdens of developing countries. And this has been very clearly emerging in the last 3 years since COVID, where we've suddenly had a very systemic debt crisis in many parts of the Global South, particularly in African countries. And China has had to step up and play a very critical role in becoming a collaborative player to some degree in these new multilateral debt restructuring initiatives. And so in that backdrop, I think having this 10 years of the BRI was an interesting turning point. There's been some talk of whether the BRI was dead in the last few years, particularly since we haven't had any of these high-profile forums in the COVID years. We've seen a decline in official lending from China's policy banks, and there's certainly been, I think, a shift in the approach and risk attitudes of China's financial institutions overall. We have a paper coming out from ODI in this month looks at the role of cynosure as well, which illustrates that it's not just lending, it's also the ability of state financial institutions and their willingness to underwrite and to de-risk overseas investment that's also been shifting, particularly in the years after 2018. However, the BRI Forum illustrated that it's clearly not dead, and there still seems to be a very clear political commitment that comes from the top. There's been a bit of an injection of new capital to the two policy banks. They both received around $50 billion each for a new financing window. The Silk Road Fund also received a new capital injection. And so it seems like the taps are turning on again in this year. But I think there is going to be a bit of a shift, and we're already seeing in previous years and also in the kind of narrative around the forum itself that China's cooperation with Global South countries is going to take a different turn. It's becoming more conservative, it's becoming more commercially oriented. There's going to be a bit more attention to commercial viability and due diligence in its projects, and to try and avoid some of the issues that led to some of the more problematic projects and the contributions to debt issues in the first place. And alongside that, just to touch briefly on the Global Development Initiative, I think this is also another area where China's still trying to demonstrate its role as a responsible stakeholder and as a serious development actor. I think it's interesting that the GDI was so very intimately integrated into the UN. It's very much a sort of sign that China is a strong supporter of UN institutions, that it views them as legitimate, and that it wants to revitalize support for the UN SDGs at a time when other development actors have been actually faltering a little bit and cutting back in their development aid and development cooperation. And so there's a clear sign that I think China also wants to shape the future orientation of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and that post-2030 agenda as well. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Very interesting. And I think there's a couple of things there that I would like to come back to that I think connect with what Carla mentioned as well in terms of China's relationship with the UN, to China's relationship to existing global institutions, and also its role perhaps in shifting them and in the future. But before that, let's pivot to Europe, which is a region of the world that has had a tumultuous relationship, I would say, with China over the past couple of years, and where I think we've seen quite a shift. But we'll have Francisca explain more about her view on how Europe-Chinese relations have changed, and especially I think insofar as they concern also economic security.
Thank you, Larry. I'm very, very happy to be here. And I'm glad you mentioned economic security, because I suppose that, the expectations is for me to start with the big change, whereas the EU launched the economic security strategy, which I feel compelled to say is country neutral. So it's not about China officially, but it was first mentioned during von der Leyen's China speech on March 30th. And, and then we had the export controls, new export controls adopted by the Netherlands, so not the European Union, but the Netherlands. And most recently, we have this anti-subsidy case against Chinese electric vehicles. So a lot has changed. The European Union also published a list of 10 critical technologies for which are undergoing a risk assessment. And although China, again, I stress this once more, is not the main target, of course, it is a major player and a major concern. I could have said this was one of the main points, as much as I could have said, the other side of de-risking was the diplomatic de-risking. So the idea that, we would engage and re-engage with China. But the reason why I'm not really focusing on either of these 2 points, and then we can talk more about these if you want to later, is because this is really EU's foreign policy towards China rather than China's foreign policy towards the EU. And this is sort of my observation at the end of 2023. A lot of what has happened in the bilateral relationship between the EU and China in the past year has been about EU's agenda towards China rather than the other way around. We haven't seen a lot of China's foreign policy and active foreign policy towards the EU, with one exception, which I find relatively funny, which is at the end of 2022, Fu Cong, the new ambassador to the European Union, arrived in Brussels. And at the very beginning of his posting, he tried to bring forward a bit of an active agenda. And the agenda was the proposal of lifting the respective sanctions that China and the EU had imposed on each other in 2021 in order to get the comprehensive agreement on investment restarted. The reason why I find this funny is because he says actually quite a bit about China's approach to the European Union to this day and China's foreign policy. First of all, there seemed to be no understanding that the reason why the EU had imposed sanctions was a violation of human rights. So until that violation of human rights was there, the EU could not lift the sanctions. But I think that what was even more interesting is that even if, it was not going to happen, but even if the EU institutions, the leadership of the EU institutions or the European Commission accepted this proposal, the European Parliament is the one who froze the ratification of the Comprehensive Agreement on Investments. And the way the proposal was posed seemed to give the impression that to this day, the Chinese have not fully grasped how the European Union works and how relevant the Parliament is in this process. So I know this may not seem much, but it is quite relevant to see that, still in 2023, after so many years of engagement, there seems to be a bit of gap between how China views the European Union and the functioning of the European Union and how the European Union really works. Now, the other point is that the reason why I say there's a lot of EU foreign policy towards China, but not necessarily the other way around. So this was the one exception, sort of, Fu Cong proposals didn't work, but at least they had a proactive agenda, is that we had lots of visits. So, Scholz went there, Macron, Sanchez, von der Leyen, Michel, Borrell. We didn't have a single visit from Xi Jinping from China to the European Union, right? So there were a lot of European leaders going to China, but not the other way around. That is another sign of a lot of proactive engagement from the European Union, but not necessarily the same coming from China. Now, of course, the dialogues restarted, high-level economic dialogue, digital dialogue, human rights dialogue, they all restarted. And we're going to have, in just a few days, the first in-person summit since 2019. Now, this summit is going to take place in Beijing. It doesn't mean that it's one more example of European leaders going to China. It's just China's turn to invite the European Union to the summit. So I want to clarify this. But again, I'm not sure China is actually charming Europe. I just think that China is doing the usual. Let's, grasp some low-hanging fruits. Let's signal something that is very easy, very positively in terms of narrative, but it's not really doing much in terms, it doesn't really require much effort on China's side. And what I'm referring to is the lifting of the visa requirements for a number of European countries. The selection is interesting. I think it's France, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and Spain. Hope I'm not forgetting anyone. I think these are the countries. Again, this says a lot. First of all, the element of the low-hanging fruit. If we go back years, it will be consistently there. And then the second element of whether we like it or not, whether they like it or not, the European Union is an important economic partner for China, and it remains such. Doesn't mean geopolitical power. Let's clarify this. It means important economic partner, which is why they try what they can without a lot of effort to make sure that they can maintain good economic relationship. And this is done at European level when possible, but even more often, and again, the state visit from the head of state of the member states in the past year demonstrate this, much more often is bilaterally with member states. And I close here.
Well, thank you, Francesca, and thank you for mentioning the visa issue, which I have found very interesting and kind of surprising in some ways, but we'll see how that actually develops, and we'll keep an eye on the summit. Let me move on to another question that I would like you all to answer. And actually, Francesca, I would like you to start with you and go in reverse here. So do you think, okay, so yes, Europe has tried very hard to engage with China, and China does not seem to be engaging quite as much with Europe. But certainly, I think we've seen a change in how European leaders have been engaging with China, right? I mean, I think it is clear that there's been a hardening of certain positions, certainly from the Commission, at least, if not all member states. Do you think this indicates that China is dealing with a more challenging foreign environment, has China's position changed at all towards Europe? I think certainly there are those in Europe who think that China has changed its foreign policy. What do you think?
So I guess there are two questions in one. The first one is whether the EU and EU member states' position has changed towards China, and then whether, China's position has changed towards the EU and EU member states. There's always sort of another layer when you talk about the European Union, but we try to keep it at EU level. In terms of the European Union, yes. I mean, if we go back pre-pandemic, it was a completely different way of looking at China. It was much more positive, both in European capitals and within Brussels. A lot has changed after the pandemic. Then we had the case of Lithuania, which of course was very relevant as well. When you have economic coercion exercised against one of your member states, that changes your perception. And then definitely Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed the perception, especially in Central and Eastern European countries who have quite dramatically started to position themselves more assertively in the conversations, and have changed the balance of the debate within the European Union. But even within the most classic actors such as France, Germany, Italy, there have been quite a few changes. Now, the baseline that has remained sort of stable is the interest in promoting good business and good economic relations. Because let's be honest, that hasn't really changed. If you look at the trip from Scholz and from Macron, priority was economic agreements, right, for their own businesses. If you look at Italy not renewing the Memorandum of Understanding for the Belt and Road Initiative in 2019, first concern is making sure that your businesses and your economic relationship are not going to take a hit when you do this. So that has sort of remained stable, but it has undeniably changed to the degree of And I think this is mostly China doing, if I have to be honest. I think the big hit was China closing down, businesses experiencing themselves how costly it is for them to be in a system where the policies can change on a day-to-day basis, and you can find yourself with less market shares just out of the day, or not being able to do your own businesses. And so a little bit has changed, and that has sort of escalated to the government level. Now, this is how the EU has changed, and let's not forget, I shouldn't mention this, but let's not forget that Merkel, no longer being the chancellor in Germany and no longer driving a relatively positive agenda towards China, has indeed made a difference. This is absolutely undeniable. Now, whether this variable alone without the other ones would have led to the same result, I don't know. We probably would have to play that out. In terms of China, it has been a little bit of a roller coaster. You have these up and downs. You have moments where, they're super nice, charming. They try to have dialogues, and they have moments where it's an absolute war. But I would say that to them, the European Union has become a much more difficult actor than it was before. They seem to be interpreting these as the EU following the United States, rather than EU having its own realization and its own analysis, and therefore changing the way they approach. But they definitely seen the EU a much more difficult actor, and you can see that in different frameworks, in what they say and in what they have been stating, and in the simple fact that, for example, Wang Yi now before the summit has said that we need to foster positive relationship, but there is an acknowledgement that we don't look at the world in the same way. So there has been quite a bit of a change in the way China approaches the European Union. I'm going to close with just one thing. It is important to understand, however, that the EU to China is not as important as the United States. So the United States is viewed as a major challenge. The EU is not seen as a at par geopolitical challenge. And this is something that doesn't always comes through in Brussels, especially.
Thank you, Francesca. Well, let me turn, going back in reverse, let me turn to Yunnan and ask you sort of a variation on the same question, which is, when looking at China's relations with BRI countries, with the global South, do you think that there are substantially more challenges in the foreign environment for China? And do you think that China's approach has changed significantly, right? We still see the BRI in a new iteration, new format, but as you said, there's a proliferation of new acronyms, there's new initiatives. Does this mean there's been a change, a substantial change, or is it just sort of a change in names?
So I think there's kind of two major trends. One is that the BRI is no longer the only game in town, and we are seeing this proliferation of new platforms and new acronyms. And I think my take on that is that it's in part a reaction to the kind of negative PR and the optics that had really been pulling down the BRI in the previous years. It's become quite tarnished, not only in the global north, with its, the original destination of the BRI was supposed to promote China-EU relations. And that has something that's seriously deteriorated in the last few years. And so the BRI is at least in Europe, is let's say on life support. But also in the global south, right? There's a lot of projects that have come under a lot of scrutiny, prominent flagship infrastructure projects. The Kenyan Standard Gauge Railway is one example where China's BRI cooperation and these mega projects that came through with Chinese finance have not seemed to pay off in the way that they were expected to, and have also caused a lot of debt issues for recipient countries. And so now a lot of these countries are trying to renegotiate and restructure their debts with China, both bilaterally and through multilateral initiatives, which I can also come to discuss. But I think the other aspect is that alongside this proliferation of new acronyms, the BRI itself is also changing. As I mentioned, we're seeing this shift to a more commercially oriented engagement with BRI partners, a shift to what's being called small and beautiful, or small yet beautiful, or small yet smart, some variation of the above, which basically indicates a shift away from that big official financed infrastructure towards smaller, leaner, more commercially oriented projects, and also a big focus to the green sector, right? The BRI of the last 10 years reflected China's industrial dominance in heavy industries in those sectors. And the BRI of the next 10 years is probably going to reflect the shape of China's economy of now. And that, I think, will entail a much more prominent visibility for clean energy, for renewables, for electric vehicles, and the current industries that China is trying to promote domestically. I think we're going to see that also spill over into the global south, just as we did with the BRI of the last decade, particularly as it seems that global north markets are increasingly wary and increasingly closed off to Chinese exports in these strategic technologies. And I think the other thing that I will mention is on the area of development finance, and I think another challenge for China and also for global South countries right now is to do with the kind of general grievances in the international financial architecture. And this is an area in which I think China finds compatriots or comrades, both via the BRICS forums and its more natural allies, but also it's a cause that's shared by countries in the global South who are systemically at a disadvantage in the dollar-based international financial architecture. A lot of the current debt issues that we're seeing originate from very much from the US Fed, and decisions made in US monetary policy have global ramifications and repercussions that have created huge fiscal squeezes across much of the global South, and have contributed to some of these shocks in external debt that we're seeing in Africa and other places. And this is an area where I think there is a growing kind of shared interest between China and other players in shifting away from the US dollar, and in promoting other alternatives. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's super interesting, and there's a lot of different questions I would like to ask you. But first, I will, especially since I've been certainly looking a lot at the issues surrounding the export and internationalization of Chinese companies in the green sectors, and especially the backlash that's created in some areas, as well as opportunities, I think, for certain countries as well. But let me first move to Carla and circle back to some of the points you made in the first your first answer concerning the China's engagement with existing institutions and the establishment of new institutions, and how this relates to the global order, and so how do you think does this mean that China's approach to foreign relations has changed substantially, and is this a response to a much tougher global environment, or how do you think of this? How should we think of it?
Yeah, I really like the way you framed the question, because in some ways it's a continuity. China has been figuring out ways of expanding its influence within the existing set of multilateral organizations, including the United Nations, for a long time. I mean, even when it began, it entered the United Nations in the early 70s. It really seized an opportunity to exercise leadership right away in some respects, and notably in the environmental area, where it played an important role in early conferences. But I think in keeping with its kind of biding its time in contrast to showing its light, or however you want to frame it. It has taken a much clearer position. And I think that does relate, as you suggested, to the fact that we're in a much more turbulent period in international affairs. And that is actually a major theme of Xi Jinping's leadership, is that we're in a period of changes not seen for a century. And that relates to the turbulence, and also an assessment that the United States is a declining power. And under those circumstances, there is, you can look at it in different ways. It's both an opportunity for China to step up to the plate. Many people attribute the problems associated that led to World War I to the failure of the United States to assume its responsibilities as a leading power at that time, the so-called Kindleberger issue. And China is poised to play a larger role, and so has launched some of these initiatives. That's certainly one way to look at it. Another is that China is opportunistically seeking to advance its interests. It has been much clearer in its attacks on the United States. I mean, in February, just before it published a position paper on the Global Security Initiative, it published a paper on attacking U.S. hegemony, which is really, it rarely named the United States specifically and in its challenges to the United States. So the fact that that paper challenging or criticizing U.S. hegemony and what it called an abuse of U.S. hegemony, that preceded its paper on the or concept paper on the Global Security Initiative is notable. And then just a few days later, it put forward its peace proposal or concept paper or position paper on Ukraine. So very interesting assertion of both criticism of the United States, followed by an assertion of China's capabilities to provide global security as a public good, global public good on the world stage. So I think we're seeing at least a clearer position from China. But all of this requires a lot of resources, a lot of commitments, a willingness by the Chinese public to underwrite a bigger role for China on the global stage. And it's not clear. I know there's a debate about the extent to which the domestic audience actually influences Chinese foreign policy. But I think, some surveys taken by Chinese think tanks suggest that there are mixed views by the Chinese public about whether it wants to play a bigger role on the international stage, and particularly at this moment when China's own engine of growth is at least sputtering a bit, although there are lots of different assessments of how long it will sputter. There are people in China's large middle class, and especially below, who are really experiencing hard times. And so I think it's a very different environment for China. But I think Xi Jinping is laying out this vision for China's global leadership. It's not, in my view, a pitch to replace U.S. hegemony with Chinese hegemony. I do think genuinely China sees the trend as one toward multipolarity, and is hoping to erect institutions that will give China its rightful voice in the world, but as it sees it, but will also bring in other powers, probably on terms that the United States and its allies will not feel comfortable with, because as some of these initiatives, like the Global Civilization Initiative, suggest, this is far from a liberal international order that China has in mind. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And as a short pitch here, for those who are interested in surveys of what Chinese people think and the methodologies, we did have a feature that we published on the Big Data China website. So if you scroll down the archives, I do recommend that. It was very interesting. And we did have a section on foreign policy as well. But sticking to the conversation here right now, I think, I think we've raised probably too many topics to be able to address. But there are a couple of things that I think are interesting here. One is that actually, when I set up this panel and was thinking of the title and everything, I really wanted this to be not about the United States, because I think, when you sit in Washington, all you talk about is U.S.-China relations, right? So but here, when we're talking, even when we're talking about the global South, or we're talking about EU-China relations, or China's relationship with all kinds of institutions globally, the U.S. is always in the backdrop, right? And the tensions or rivalry with the United States, or the United States' current position globally is always there in the backdrop. So I think that's one interesting data point that I'm taking away from this, that in a way it's almost impossible to talk about China's relationship with other countries without keeping in mind its relations with the United States, and also the United States' relations with many other countries in the world, and its responsibility in some areas. So I think, given all this, I guess, it's almost the end of the year. And so what are the trends that you're going to be keeping an eye on this coming year? Why don't we invert the order? We'll start with you, Nan, now.
Thanks, Ilaria. So in the coming year, the things that I personally will be keeping an eye on will be one aspect of how China engages with the global South and through in terms of its overseas finance, and that is probably on the issue of debt restructuring. So alongside monitoring the new GDI and how the BRI 2.0 shapes up, I think one of the kind of critical tests of China's influence and involvement in global governance institutions is how it cooperates in the ongoing and quite prolonged debt restructuring negotiations that have gone on, both under the G20 Common Framework, where we've had Chad, Zambia, Ethiopia, Ghana join, particularly in the case of Zambia, where over the previous year, it has been a fraught and also quite geopoliticized area. Primarily, substantially, it's been a conflict between the sort of new emerging creditors, both from China and from private sector creditors and bondholders. And this is also an area in which US-China tensions, I think, have not played a positive role. It's hard to say, how much the US spy balloon scandal impacted things, but I think Zambia was a bit of a casualty and became a political football for the US to beat China with, and vice versa, and all of that at the cost of Zambia's sovereign government and people themselves. And so how China plays ball when it comes to the G20 Common Framework, how the Common Framework establishes new, let's not call them rules, but new practices and new processes on how to swiftly and fairly implement debt restructuring, and how China plays ball in new forums such as the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, or GSDR, will be I think critical, particularly as more and more countries, I think, are facing the strain. And related to that, I think the other big forum in the next year will be the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, or FOCAC. This, I think, will once again be held in Beijing. This is the triannual forum between China and African countries, and it's probably one of the longest running and most institutionalized platforms for China's relations with Global South, and particularly with the Africa region. It'll be a great gathering. It'll be another opportunity for China to demonstrate its leadership as a developing country, a leadership of the Global South. It'll be an opportunity as well, though, for African governments and leaders to exercise their influence over the agenda of the forum, and possibly as well to try and exercise influence bilaterally with China's leaders, with Xi Jinping himself, because this is one of the rare opportunities in which having summit diplomacy allows bilateral meetings to happen. All right, thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting list, and I think we'll be coming back to you to hear more about what, how your assessment goes of how everything develops over the next year. Francesca, to you, what are you going to be looking out for?
So I guess I challenge the situation by saying that China only grants low-hanging fruits. So I suppose the sanctions situation is one to watch. The EU is going to try to ask China to do something about the 13 entities that they have identified as circumventing EU sanctions against Russia. If the Chinese do something about that, it would be really interesting to watch. Even more interesting is perhaps if the Chinese do not do anything about that, what would the EU do? Because Chinese entities were dropped of the list of sanctioned entities last year at the very last minute. So now, if the Chinese will not do anything, perhaps the EU will find itself again in front of this massive conundrum, which is, are we going to sanction China, knowing that probably there will be repercussions? And so then what the repercussions will be linked to these. I will watch the development of the economic security agenda, the consequences of the risk assessment that will be run on 4 critical technologies, whether that will lead to new measures or the expansion of existing measures such as export controls. We'll follow closely the anti-subsidy case, not just specifically the one on electric vehicles from the EU, but also whether other countries will follow the EU on this path, and whether other items and commodities will actually be analyzed under similar circumstances. Finally, I guess we cannot avoid to mention that it is EU elections in 2024, and that can have a major impact on both how China in the future will approach the European Union, but even more so how the EU will approach China. I don't know if it is fully appreciated outside of Brussels how much of an impact the administration, the presidency of the Commission by Ursula von der Leyen has had on the European Union and on the China agenda. So should there be a different administration, we cannot exclude a different course of action. And then finally, 2 things, and then I promise I'll actually close. One is because there will be EU elections, and because we've had a few rounds of interesting elections in member states, whether those new administrations will have a different approach towards China, especially an eye on the Netherlands, which is such an important actor within the European Union, has been doing immense progress in terms of economic security agenda, actually leading in large part of the economic security agenda in the EU. And whether, this quote unquote, it has been mentioned so many times as a charm offensive towards European businesses will actually work. There's definitely a window of opportunity for European businesses to gain a lot out of China, but whether they will treat it as a window that will eventually close, or whether they would treat it as China is back to being the open place that we all wanted it to be, is really yet to be seen. And I guess this is a very long list of things to watch in 2024, but I'll stop it here.
I think we all have a very long list of things that we'll be looking out for, so that makes a lot of sense, and those all seem very important. And certainly I'm following the anti-subsidy investigation very closely as well, and certainly trying to imagine which other sectors might also come under investigation. But Carla, moving to you, the last word is yours. What are you going to be watching? What do you think matters when it comes to China's foreign policy next year?
Well, everything matters. I think China affects everything, but my own work will certainly continue to track these new acronyms, as Yunan put it so beautifully, and see where they head. I think also how they relate to the BRI in its new form. I think that will be very interesting. from my position at USIP, at U.S. Institute of Peace, we're very interested in how peace and security relate to the BRI going forward, and whether China will use its global security initiative to try to safeguard its interests in countries. Many of its BRI investments have been challenged by the economic turbulence and by also political changes in countries where it has significant investments. So that will be something to watch, how it engages some of its initiatives, say in ASEAN, on the global security initiative. Maybe it will, we've seen evidence that it might use the Lansang Mekong cooperation, for example, as a new global security initiative platform, as it tries to promote more security in a region that is really got a lot of significant infrastructure investments in. So that's one area, but of course have to come back to the US-China relationship, because we've made headway at the end of this year, but it remains a very fraught relationship. Really, it's terrifying that that for much of the period that the Biden administration has been in office, there has been very limited military-to-military communication, and yet we've had all of this military hardware bumping into each other practically from the two sides in China's in the Western Pacific. That's really scary, but we are going to be tested. The relationship will be tested early in 2024 with the election in Taiwan, and how the two sides handle the outcome of that election, which is which is quite uncertain. And so that will be very interesting and challenging. And beyond that, we have some new experimentation in the bilateral relationship on learning to cooperate again in a relationship that is competitive and increasingly one of animosity, which is on the climate issue. There is an agenda, a positive agenda for that, including a very well-designed initiative to use subnational linkages to try to boost progress between the US and China. That's still the two largest emitters and make some headway on this really critical issue. So just as you said, too many issues to address, but I look forward to your writing, Ilaria, on the climate issue.
Well, thank you for mentioning it. I think, yes, I think it's obviously, as we mentioned before, COP28 is ongoing right now, and we saw the Sunland statement between the US and China. So I think that is also going to be an interesting area to follow, and also one which I think reflects the broader theme of this conversation, where I think as you said, Carla, there's some experimentation going on, some looking for new models of cooperation. And I think what we're seeing, what has emerged from this conversation, is that we're seeing China looking for new models, but also gradually developing and working on existing structures in its existing relationships globally. So I think what we'll be seeing more of that next year, it sounds like, from everybody, but probably a ramping up in some areas, and really sort of a mixed bag in terms of the opportunities and challenges that China is going to be facing on the global stage. So thank you so much for all of you, Yunnan, Francisca, Carla, and thank you to all of our listeners today for tuning in. This brings our second annual Big Data China conference to an end. We've heard from a variety of voices from academia, think tanks, businesses, and they've been on the sort of China's economic trajectory, the outlook of scholarly exchanges between the US and China in this era of competition. And now, of course, we've heard about the outlook for China's relations with the world. There's a mixed picture, as we said. There's substantial challenges ahead, but I think we'll be continuing to watch China. Please visit our website, bigdatachina.csis.org. We'll have more features coming out where we will be using and highlighting academic quantitative research on China to try and understand the challenges that face China and the world moving forward. Thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.
万事不求人，私人助理 私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助，超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界现在体验，请去3w.6度.world。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了，还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。一起来3w.6度.world尝试吧。